Hey associates, all right, so this video lecture is just going to go over some of that foundational information intro and just my tips for beginning a research project, especially as these research reports and formal reports show up a little bit differently than the research that you might have done in more like an essay or argument forming course. And so first, in our field, right, technical writing, TCID, info design, sort of sharing technical information, business information, we are really focused on three aspects of what we consider research and what we would consider writing a formal report around. And so first, research is ultimately this way of like knowing and learning about the world in this really kind of nuanced. And so we like to come up with questions and are going to, write this formal report that nobody wants to read, remember, it's worth going through that effort because we actually have some nuance and some kind of gray areas and some places where we can actually expand the knowledge rather than kind of cut and dry describing something. So we want research that is nuanced. We want research that is rigorous, and by rigorous, we mean that there are very clear standards. It's very transparent. The execution, somebody could replicate this and sort of reproduce it. They might get, slightly varying results, but there is a very clear standard for how it should be done that somebody else could follow, and that standard is ultimately valid, really meaning that it is measuring what you set out to measure or research what you set out to, discover, as well as reliable. So as people replicate the study, it is going to come up with very similar, aspects. So if we have nuanced, rigorous, and then last, deliberate, right? We're not going to be off writing these long form technical reports without really intention behind it. And so research for us is really being able to, observe and measure like data around some sort of question or phenomena or issue to really intentionally, specifically, and concretely discover kind of the path forward. And definitely as technical writers, that's usually going to come in the form of something like a recommendation report. So we're doing this research with some nuance, rigor, and very, deliberate intention to ultimately help recommend an action, or a feasibility study to ultimately find out what is the most feasible path, or is this solution feasible? Or you might come up with things like white papers that again have some nuance, have rigor, are very deliberate to ultimately introduce kind of a new process or product to stakeholders and the market. So one of those differences might come in, right? In your past essays, you probably, were given a topic and we're just kind of like, okay, read papers, do secondary research, which is fantastic. You'll have to do that certainly for this paper too. But that's kind of where it ends, is a lot more of just describing things that you've read to form maybe a central argument that you're trying to make. And for this report, and for kind of us on the technical side, we're a lot more interested in some like reporting empirical research. So it's some of that, observed data, entering in more primary research sources. So that way we can kind of add, again, nuance. So what are sort of the intersecting intricate details, rigor, right? How are our standards really clear and transparent and something somebody else could replicate and really understand the logic and validity behind? And then deliberate. We're making very clear choices, and that deliberate, those intentional choices come down into things like our paradigm and our research questions and the methods that we choose. And so a paradigm, listen, it's okay if you don't 100% get it or you haven't heard this word before, because grad students spend multiple classes and entire semesters kind of understanding and trying to unpack paradigm. So right at this intro level, the thing that you need to know going into your research is that we all kind of exist sort of in a cave. You might have heard of Plato's allegory of the cave. If you are going to take a rhetoric class, I'm sure they will go into that more in-depthly, but kind of the cliff notes of how it applies to technical writing and our research. Basically, right, the cave is the boundary of our knowledge, and depending sort of where you are situated in the cave, it makes a difference on what you actually see and are able to know. And so somebody sort of in the depths and the dark of the cave, and that's kind of all they've ever been, have a certain point of view. And then as you start to come out of the cave and, see the rest of the world, right, you enter a new paradigm where the boundaries of your knowledge are kind of pushed. And so our paradigm, the sort of entry point for our research, is kind of what does our cave look like? What do we notice? What are we able to see within our own caves? And we have four of sort of the biggies. There's definitely, more in the differences between them. Again, you can get into in your advanced or even grad level classes, but the big four for you to know going into this, intro research report especially, is going to be really the post-positivist, critical, and constructivist. Now, there is such a thing as the positivist, but it doesn't really get used that much anymore because it was very kind of cut and dry. It lacked some of that nuance for research, really just saying like, there's a true reality and we are going to use science to figure it out. And that kind of gave way to instead these, big three that are going to be most useful for you in your reports, which is really that idea of the post-positivist. So people kind of took the ideas from that positivist mindset and basically said, cool, we do think we can figure out reality. Like there is a single thing happening and we're going to figure out what it is, but we recognize there's some limits, right? Whether human error, the instruments that we have, the tech we have, there's always going to be limits on the knowledge. Now we might continue to expand, and our goal is to expand the boundaries of our knowledge, but there are going to be limits. So that's kind of the first big one. The second big one, critical. I'm a big fan of this. This is where my research typically lands. And in it, basically, our cave says, hey, there's a reality out there, but it's always going to be obstructed by our power structures and our social dynamics and our situation. And so if you are hanging out in kind of that critical paradigm, that critical cave, a lot of the research kind of gets focused on, let me kind of figure out how our power structures and how people are keeping other people from sort of this idea of truth. And truth is really focused on interrogating kind of those dynamics between people. And then last is the constructivist is another big one you might pay attention to. This one's really gaining popularity because it's basically hey, what is true reality, right? The truth is always going to be relative to who we are and our position, and it kind of combines, I think, a really nice way of critical, recognizing everyone's position and their truth, right? It's going to depend on where they basically are situated amongst other people, and opens things up for a lot more interpretation. And so all three of these can exist across every discipline, and have different, research methods and fantastic questions. They aren't, sometimes they're set up in tension with each other, but really we need researchers coming at the same kind of situation from all three paradigms to really actually understand and really push kind of the boundary of what's going on. So let's kind of think about this in terms of an example, right? And so, machine learning, sort of artificial intelligence, just overall technology and its connection to society continues to move forward and grow. So if that's kind of the topic we're going to look at, let's talk through and let's think about, the three paradigms, right? The people in the cave, they hear about, right, this AI, what is it that they're actually able to focus on, to see, and ultimately the questions they would ask. And so the post-positivist, remember, they say true reality exists, but we do have some limits, okay? Take a beat, think about, okay, what would they say, or what would they want to study about, new tech? The critical folks, there's a reality out there, but it's constantly being obstructed and competed for and distorted by power and social structures. What would they maybe want to ask or think about with, advancing tech? And then constructivists, reality is relative. It's up for interpretation. Yeah. It's a subjective thing that we have to study and keep learning from other people. What would they say about it? So just take a quick pause, think about maybe your responses, and let's see what I thought about. So the post-positivist, right, if they're like, no, there's like a truth and we're on the hunt to find it, they might just ask more questions about how this new technology is going to benefit the future, kind of coming from this point of view of like, we will use our science and our research and our studies to figure out how to ultimately shape this tech and that it is going to benefit the future, and we just want to research how to make that happen and how to, you know, sort of get there. The critical folks might be less focused on like the sort of what is happening and like what is going on, and a lot more into the like, who is it going to benefit? It's like, okay, post-positive for finding ways that it benefits, but like, who actually is running that benefit? Who's going to be used to create this benefit? Like, how is power going to intersect with our technologies that we need to be thinking about? And then the constructivists, right? They're like, yeah, it's all up for interpretation. Truth is dependent on us and our dynamics, right? They might ask more questions like, how actually do we measure a benefit, and how can we work together and kind of get all these different perspectives to move forward towards a goal. So they definitely, you know, intersect with each other. A lot of people kind of come at it with sort of merging paradigms, we're kind of starting to see. But for your projects, just kind of think about, okay, are you more interested in the sort of state of reality, and sort of believe like we can find an answer and there is like an answer? Are you more interested in sort of how power and our social structures and dynamics are, you know, kind of interfering with the situation or influencing the situation? Then you might be more of a critical paradigm person. And if you are just really, really interested in understanding everybody's perspective and situation as it relates to, you know, whatever context or questions or topic that you're in, you know, then you might come to it with more of a constructivist and be like, you know, it's all relative. So, you know, let's figure it out from this angle and this angle and this angle. Right. Now, no matter what paradigm you're in, we all still follow a basic kind of research process. And that research process, right, for us in our formal reports, really, again, we're focused on how can we create some nuance, how can we make sure it's very rigorous, and how can we be intentional, right? You know, how can we like make sure that it's very deliberate and we move forward? So first, you know, we usually start with theory, and the theory is kind of, you might have learned it maybe in high school or whatever, as, you know, kind of a best guess at something. That's not really what theory is. Theory is actually the current explanation we have that frames, right, the knowledge and explains what's going on. And so theories are used to like unpack situations. Theory is used to set up kind of research and studies and questions, but it's not necessarily something that has to be like proved or disproved, right? At this higher order in this field, it really is more of a framework for studying something, and it offers a framework to try and explain what's going on. So we'll start with like our theory, and then based on the theory that you have, you can come up with the method. So, okay, how are you now going to, right, use this framework to actually study the thing that you're interested in, and ultimately you come up with some conclusions. Now, all of these gears are interconnected because you can sometimes start with more of a conclusion, be like, I observed this, and here's what I think's happening, and then that kind of turns the cog into the theory, right? And then we're like, okay, we keep observing this, let's build a theory out of it. Other times, you don't typically start like the methods necessarily. There certainly could be case studies, but if you did, like, you'd have some methods that start to generate some observations that then help you get to some theory. So no matter kind of which one you start, they all turn each other, but generally, especially because we are in such a stage where so much knowledge exists and so many theories are already out there for us to use, we're gonna like start with that, right? It's just the age that we're in, you know, in like the 40s and 50s, and earlier than that, right? They often started with more of the like methods and conclusions, and then started to build out the theory. But now we can learn from, you know, what they learned and adapt, and it's more of a situation of using the theory, having some methods of research, getting that nuance, that rigor, finding these conclusions that then extend or just revise or expand the theory in terms of how it helps explain something. That's me. All right, so you got your paradigm kind of in order. And you're starting to think about, okay, what is the research? So now we got to get into research questions. Here's the thing. A question needs to be really specific, and it needs to be answerable through this, you know, nuanced, rigorous, intentional investigation. So you don't want to ask things that are super close-ended or, you know, purely descriptive. That's not going to work very well for your final reports or for just like technical writing in our kind of reports that we tend to see in our field. So it's not, you know, an essay that just kind of that presents like a really super specific argument or a summary of something else. Instead, it is, how can I expand the body of knowledge based on your topic? So the biggest difference between maybe an essay sort of thesis is you go into it, here's the thing that I need to argue and explain, and then you like go off and find the sources and you build an argument out of it. For us in our reports, right, we're much more on the like, hey, we did all this research, now let me deliver it to you so you can do something, you know, usable with it. And so we have my girl Tina. She wants to know, you know, if horses get songs stuck in their heads. Honestly, not a very good research question. It's certainly interesting. Like, I'm not, you know, mad at it. I'd love to know that. But it's not a good question because, one, it's very kind of close-ended. Basically, it's like a yes, no. Second, how are you going to study this, Tina? Like, right now, anyway, we do not really have the tech to do it. And third, like, what is going to be that usable result or finding from it, right? Just kind of like a fun. So if Tina was like in our class, was learning to be a technical writer, had to, you know, create a formal report that was going to really help, you know, extend knowledge, be usable for the field, maybe instead of asking if you think horses get songs stuck in their head, or she change it into something like, how does noise pollution impact wildlife in rural areas? Right, could be a much stronger question, you know, that Tina could ask in our intro course, right? So now we're still thinking about, okay, noise pollution, right? That is something that is expanding out as, you know, sort of urban sprawl and everything encroaches on what used to be very, you know, rural or wildlife centric areas. We could even say agricultural, you know, areas or agricultural animals. If she wanted to really focus on horses, but really it's noise pollution. This is an issue that is, you know, starting to expand out. Then we have the actual impacts, right? And we can measure and we can assess and we can, you know, have that systematic observation of the impacts on, right, the wildlife and now in this very specific area. So go from a yes, no, that's a fun question, into a usable, now this comes up with different solutions and challenges and things that we can do about it for better questions. So let's kind of play a tiny little game and think about some. So a little this or that. So you could ask, what is the current state of pheasant populations in Colorado? This was a real question and prompt that a student did or wanted at first proposed doing a report on, or would you kind of see yourself being able to write a better report it with, you know, in what ways will urban sprawl across the Front Range impact pheasant populations in Colorado, right? So the core topic is still there, right? They wanted to research pheasants, right? And so we have, you know, pheasants and what's happening to their population. Or this one is much more of a like, here's the number. Maybe here's some issues. It's much more descriptive. There's not, okay, what are we going to do about it? Or like, what is the impact? Instead, this one, and we identify, okay, here's a whole very specific thing that we think is probably impacting this pheasant population that we are going to have to confront and that we could do something about in terms of maybe designing the way our sprawl happens. And then we have this very specific area, right? Front Range, Colorado, which is kind of like big. So suddenly your report actually balloons out because, maybe the populations are going to vary in these different areas. And then we're really thinking about, impacts on it rather than just describing the state. Now we can add some knowledge of and this is an impact and how it's impacting it, why it's impacting it, and how we might work to reduce that impact. All right. So take your core topic and then really start to unpack what are the factors at play, what is the issue at play, and what types of questions will create content that people can use and do something about. Cool. All right, what about this one, right? So we could start with, do residents like the new trailhead? Okay, one way that we could definitely quickly fix this is to instead think about, how does the new trailhead impact traffic, wildlife sightings, and property values, right? So again, this time we're going from kind of like a yes or no type of question, which not a cool, great, extending, nuanced, rigorous, intentional report makes. Nope, nope. But now we can say, okay, we're still focused on, right, this new trailhead, but now we want to specifically, right, look at traffic impacts. We want to look at wildlife, and we want to look at property values, right? And now we have three really great kind of criteria and research points that we're now bringing knowledge together to ultimately answer a question that people could maybe do something about, right? If we know the impact on traffic, we could then deliver that to, the right people, the city, and maybe they think about different roads, structures, or parking lots, right? If we have information on wildlife sightings and the impacts there, right, you could deliver that to the Parks Department. Property values, right, that could be delivered and acted on way more than just a, hey, do you like it? Yeah, sure, maybe, I don't know. So think about adding some measures. And then kind of for this last one, really just reinforces question or research question. This was a research question that I did, I guess, in grad school, and actually got to present it at a national conference, which was pretty cool, pretty interesting. But my initial question, right, I just started out, and you can start by just asking a question. So my question was, what are people saying about the Black Panther movie? And I was super excited about it. I kind of thought, I wonder what people are saying. Right, so I started with a basic question, and then I turned that basic question and just interest area into a research question. And I did that by focusing, okay, civic discourse, right? That was a area of literature, right, that I was really into. And then I was like, let's focus on race and sociopolitics, specifically. So it's not just what are they saying, but what are they saying about these really, impactful topics? Especially, this original movie came out in 2018, 19, so especially important then. And online comments, right? So instead of just what are people saying, now it's okay, I have a place I can go to. Online comments, that's what I'm going to look at. Now I have direction for my methods. What am I actually looking at? Race and sociopolitics, how people talking about race and politics when they're commenting on reviews to this movie, or they're talking about this movie. And then the civic discourse gives me some of that theory, right? So that was my kind of theory that I got to use. Oof, writing with a mouse is hard. Here we go. Theory. And so instead of, the theory is the framework that helps me explain, right, the topic. So I went from just a interesting kind of personal question, what are people saying about the movie, into no, actually, using this really key theory about civic discourse and all the things that we know and how we can study and explain and talk about people talking about stuff in public places around race and sociopolitics, right? These really timely, trendy, important topics for our social structure manifested online comments. So I'm really looking at, a specific area. So think about as you're building your questions. Start with what is the basic kind of issue that you might want to do related to your industry, your interest, and then turn a basic question into a research question by thinking about what is it actually that you want to explain, how is it going to extend our understanding of the world, and what kind of paradigm might you be coming through. All right, there are two kind of big sort of types, I guess, of research design that you probably have heard about, qualitative and quantitative. A lot of people sometimes, again, put them like their intention or competition to each other, but ultimately we need both quantitative researchers and qualitative researchers studying the same thing to get a better understanding. And so quantitative research, we can think of it, as really like big, right? So usually, and the thing that it does so well is taking big data sets and then coming up with kind of generalizable inferences and explanations, right? So if you're like, I want to go big and really just understand sort of a larger trend, right, you might end up in more of a quantitative method, quantitative side. Qualitative tends to go deep, right? Is one way to sort of think about it. And so with qualitative, we tend to have smaller samples. So you might have a lot more qualitative studies on the same thing to really understand the picture of what's going on. But that's because each one of these studies is going a lot deeper into the specifics of that little sample, right? So you could have one really big kind of quantitative study that's going to take a lot of data in and really kind of push sort of a big agenda, if you will, or kind of be like, yes, and this is what the survey is saying, or this is the kind of experiments and the trends, and we can replicate it over and over and over and keep getting very similar sort of results usually, because it is more that breadth of understanding, but not necessarily super depth of understanding. Qualitative tends to be in a very, very small sample because we're really trying to like ask a lot of questions about that small little area. Again, we need both of them to actually understand what's happening with the phenomena. It just depends on what questions you tend to ask. And so just kind of the difference in, especially for technical writers, how you might fall or use some of these. And it is definitely more and more common and more important and ultimately valuable for researchers to use what we call mixed methods, which is just you have some qualitative stuff, you have some quantitative stuff, and it helps you understand kind of that situation a little bit better. So qualitative, right? A lot of people are like, it's words. Sure, I guess. I mean, you're going to be writing a lot, whether you're qualitative or quantitative. It just depends where the writing lands. But qualitative, think of it as expressing an understanding of human actions. And again, we're focused on really deep, small samples usually because we want to really explain and understand like what humans more are doing there. Quantitative is usually expressing a situation numerically. So that's where it is much more of like numbers bound, if you will. But it is less about sort of expressing what's happening in terms of like describing it and making these like inferences and stories and like unpacking it. And it's much more of like, here's the situation, right? Here's how the numbers play out. And so in that way, it's a lot more on breadth of understanding to try to generalize and predict behavior. Qualitative can still help predict behavior, and quantitative can definitely still help us understand human action. That's why mixed methods is really great, and we need both of them. But when you're like, what's the difference? You kind of think of it as like, do you want a really deep understanding of like explaining human actions, or do you want more of like a breadth to kind of try and predict and generalize the situation? Qualitative, typically, right? Critical and constructivists are going to use qualitative because we want to like figure out what is like happening that numbers can't quite show you. Whereas quantitative tends to be more suited for post-positive work, where it's like there is a truth and the number shows the truth, and this is the state of the situation that we're going to go with. So again, Do you want to just understand, like, here is the situation, or do you want to really like pick at and unpack and explore the situation from different angles? Quantitative is kind of better for here's the situation. Qualitative sometimes tends to be a lot better for let me like unpack the situation. Some of the methods: interviews, case studies, textual analyses, all of those are really common, great qualitative kind of methods for tech writers. Quantitative, it's going to be more surveys, especially if you don't have a lot of open-ended questions, but it's more of like on a scale of 1 to 5. Manipulations, experiments, I mean, those are pretty classic. And then any kind of statistical or content analysis. Again, more or less they fall into these categories, but you could definitely do one mixed method, which would be great. You know, have a survey that has both that kind of quant data, and then you dive really deep into some of the open-ended themes, and then maybe you follow up with an interview, that kind of thing. All work really, really well. So don't get too caught up into which one. Instead, it's more important to get caught up and really think about what is going to be the best for your research questions. And as we kind of start to wrap up, research ethics, can't forget our ethics that are going to be coming into play, especially, and no matter what, qualitative, quantitative, post-positivist, critical, constructivist, we all have to follow some ethics. So with experiments, especially, we're worried about mental and physical harm. For example, another classic, if you've never heard of the Milgram experiments, you go to our library database and just type in like Milgram experiments, and a bunch of really interesting papers and articles and stuff will come up. But basically it was a psychological experiment that ultimately showed that, you know, humans suck, kind of. But really it showed that we will go to great lengths to be like obedient, and when we perceive authority and when they tell us what to do, especially, you know, the study kind of came out after the World Wars, and so there was a lot of questions about like how could this have happened, and basically there is, you know, because of this experiment we saw some of that evidence of like, yeah, because when people tell you to do something we tend to do it, but it was a super unethical study, and it definitely sparked a lot of, you know, research review boards and new ethics standards, because it really messed up the participants, because they thought, they were led to believe that they were shocking somebody on the other side of this wall, until that person stopped responding and they like continued shocking them, and it had a lot of like emotional, psychological harm on the participants. So that's like on the mental side, right? We don't do that. It's just a great example of what not to do. What you should do: make sure people know what's going on, that they are going to feel, you know, ultimately safe, that you have a really good debrief with them. And if you are kind of pushing into more taboo, sort of dark, scary, gray area research, that you have things like counseling, you know, for them available right away so they can kind of unpack what just happened. On the physical side, again, horrible experiment. Tuskegee, basically they wanted to understand the progression of syphilis if they didn't treat it, and they continued to do this on patients even after we had penicillin, which was like a very effective and like the treatment for it, but they just kept it going, and it was horrible. That's another thing that you should definitely look up. And, you know, Tuskegee is definitely one of those examples, if you need more of them, of really how messed up also our science and medical community has intersected with race and racism in the US, because Tuskegee was explicitly, they tested it on Black men, and it went through the 70s, which the 70s were only 50 years ago. Just keep that in mind. A few other things that are only 50 years old. Our first cell phones and digital cameras kind of came out in the 70s. MRI machines are from the 70s. The final season of Mad Men was set in the 70s, and probably your mom or your dad or your aunt or uncle or some immediate family member also was probably born in or even before the 70s. So really horrible all around. President Clinton had to issue an apology. Again, he was like a president not that crazy long ago. So it all just kind of speaks to, just how intense, right? If we're not following good ethics and we allow and really don't stop and interrogate even our own biases and our, history, a lot of really, really horrible harm can go. One of the biggest things with Tuskegee that is an absolute no-no, again, they didn't have even informed consent. They didn't really explain what they were going to do or tell the participants and the patients what was happening, or, give them the option for the treatment later. They just kind of tested on them and didn't really tell them what was going on, and kind of under some false pretenses. So with your experiments, reduce mental, physical harm, be good to your participants and make sure that they are okay and that you're doing right by them and their humanity. Surveys, interviews, ethics come into play here. We don't want to have leading questions and we want to reserve judgment. So basically that means, don't ask them, isn't X, terrible for the environment? That's a very leading question because somebody's going to be like, yes it is. Instead, you just ask, like, what are your thoughts on X, as it relates to the environment, right? Give people the space to answer as they actually feel, and then reserve any judgments, especially if you're doing like an interview. You gotta have that good poker face and try not to react too much, because then that will kind of ruin the rest of your interview or your questions and change the dynamic. Also keep the identity of your sample protected, right? We don't want to be putting everybody's responses out on blast here. And then when it comes to textual analysis, so that's where you are looking at sort of documents or items or just kind of like observations for your key research. The main thing is just that you have really clear standards for your evaluation. I mean, you would do that anyway because our research, right, you want it to have that rigor. People should be able to replicate it and understand, but especially on a textual analysis where it is kind of you unpacking and analyzing this thing sort of yourself, or maybe you have, a team that can do that, and that certainly helps and help you with it. Just make sure you have really strong justifications for, why you are coming up with these findings and these results, and make sure that your inferences are just reasonable, just meaning like somebody else could look at them and be like, oh yeah, like I totally see where you're coming from with that, or I definitely could, following the same methods, the same sort of standards that you followed, get to a very similar conclusion as well. Basically, you just don't want to be like coming in out of left field because that's what you think the answer is, when actually the text, the observations, the subject, the data isn't really giving you those vibes. Why why are we spending almost 40 minutes, listening and talking about this? Because like most jobs want people who can, right, evaluate stuff, demonstrate analytical thinking, reasoning skills. All of that comes into being able to have good, research that is, going to be nuanced, going to be rigorous, going to have like a deliberateness to it, some good intention. And so, this research report, this project can be one of those concrete examples. I used to be like, yeah, I actually had to do a really intense, kind of long, formal report, and I had to use all of these research skills, and here's the question I came up with and the paradigm that I used, and here's why the methods are going to work for it. And this can be one of those places you demonstrate that you have, right, some of this like reasoning skill, right? You demonstrate, right, that you are able to evaluate things like options and be able to move forward. So, quick review. Our research, right? We're operating in this empirical research, so it's not just a summary or a descriptive kind of research report. You actually need to investigate a super specific question that's going to give you observable, measurable data that then you can report back to your client, report out in your formal report that helps somebody take action and expands our understanding of the world. Paradigms determine your approaches and the answers, right? So you don't have to stress too much about, I'm not totally sure what paradigm I'm in, right? We all are just in one. But if you are able to kind of take that time and really just acknowledge, okay, are you more interested in like the state of things and trying to explain to the best of our knowledge limits, just what the situation is and how it operates, then you're a little bit more of that post-positivist, and you might end up doing more of like quantitative approaches to it, and asking questions like that. If you are way more interested in like how people are interacting with each other and influencing the situation, and how like our power structures, our government, our social dynamics, our race dynamics, our economic dynamics, all of that kind of is messing up sort of the state of things, or like things exist because of these power structures, and you really want to dig into that, you might be more of a critical person, and you might find more answers to your questions using qualitative approaches, possibly. And if you're more of like, I think it's all relative, and I really just want to understand like this thing from all sorts of different sides, and I'm open to conflicting sides and things being in tension, and I want to try to figure out like what is the relative understanding, then you might be more of a constructivist person. And you can kind of go either way, but you probably would end up with more qualitative methods as well. Your methods. Don't start with a method. Don't be like, I really want to do an experiment. Like start with a question. And if the question falls into a paradigm, and the paradigm, produces work within, certain methods, like that's the method that you should use. So figure out what's suited for your research rather than what you think that you want to do, just to make sure that you actually get those nuanced, rigorous, intentional research questions and answers. And ethics, do the right thing. But even, right, post-positivists, you're out there saying, yeah, there is a right thing. The critical folks, right, you're out saying, well, right really, is going to be benefiting one person and always hurting another person, and so who is here defining right? And the constructivists are like, well, right just depends on the angle that you're looking at it at. So really minimize harm. That's what you need to do in your ethics. Minimize harm, whether it's emotional or physical, and you do that by being really transparent, and make sure that you're just being accurate and reasonable in the data and the findings that you report, and big picture, you'll probably be okay. All right. And last, it all goes back to effective writing. You're doing all this research and work, and you're going to put it in a formal report, so that way people can use it and do something with the content. So just remember, we have basically 3 steps for effective writing, no matter what, as technical writers that we've talked about. First, we want to be very clear, right? Be appropriate with the jargon, right? You don't always have to use like the most hoity-toity word, like use appropriate jargon, and if you do use things, think about explaining it in a glossary for folks who might not know that word. Make sure you have good background context, that you like put what needs to be put in the report so somebody can understand where you're coming from, and make sure you have appropriate graphics as well. All right, and we think about our data visuals and that we're choosing, right, the best visual that isn't going to obscure the situation. Second, be organized. Also goes back to that taxonomy. We love it. Use your headings, bullet points, font choices, all of that to help your reader find the information. These reports are long. They tend to be a little bit dense, but people need it to do an action, understand the world better, make decisions for their company. So make sure that it is really nice and organized, and clear to follow. And then last, be accurate. Duh. Like effective writing is going to be correct and accurate, and so use your analytical reasoning, research skills, tell us the truth, be helpful, right? The point here is not to necessarily persuade or prove your argument like in more of like a rhetorical essay, right? You don't have a thesis that you're trying to like, yes, I need to prove this right. It's not an argument, right? It's let me do this research and answer this question so that way we can move forward with the correct actions. So you need to be truthful and helpful, in the information that you report out, so that way we can move forward with the correct actions. And with that, you'll be off to the races with your research and your project. Thanks, associates. Vibes.